Welcome. This week we're going to be discussing two different works. The first is Joseph Conrad's novella, Heart of Darkness, which was published in 1899 in Blackwood's Magazine as a serialized fiction in three parts. The second is an essay that responds to Conrad's novella, and that essay is by Chinua Achebe, and it's titled An Image of Africa, Racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. This essay was presented as a lecture at the University of Massachusetts in 1974 and was later included in a collection of Achebe's essays that was published in 1988. This particular video is going to be giving you some background information on Joseph Conrad, on the Heart of Darkness, and on the colonial experience on which that story comments. We'll start with a discussion of Joseph Conrad. Conrad was born in 1857. He died in 1924. And he was a prolific fiction writer who wrote short stories and novels. And he's become one of those classic literary authors that students of British fiction just have to study. But while he spent much of his professional life in Great Britain, he didn't actually become a British citizen until he was in his 20s, and English wasn't even his first language. Joseph Conrad was born in the Russian-occupied territory of Poland. His parents were Polish nationalists who were exiled to northern Russia in 1862 for their rebellious political activities. And they ended up dying in exile in northern Russia when Conrad was a child. And these are experiences that biographers argue contribute to the strong sense of isolation and loss that pervade most of Conrad's works. In 1874, Conrad began working on sailing ships, first in France and then in England, where he eventually passed an exam to become a captain of the British Merchant Services. That was in 1886. And eventually he decided to leave sailing and become a professional fiction writer. And he settled down in England, got married, raised a family, and began writing stories as a commercial fiction writer. And he was pretty successful. And his mark was largely made by writing sea adventure stories of the kind that you've read for this week. So his writing overall is known for its lush descriptions, for its moralistic reflections, and for its ornate rhetorical devices. In particular, for his use of frame narrative. And a frame narrative is where you have a story embedded in another story. We saw a version of the frame narrative with The Handmaid's Tale. Offred tells us her story that takes almost the entire novel. And then in the last chapter, we realize that her story is actually a transcribed memoir that someone has actually presented to us. In other words, we realize that Offred's story is a work within actually a larger fictional story. Now, Heart of Darkness works much the same way. It's bookended on either side with this larger story in which Marlowe's story is nested. So it opens with Charles Marlowe on board a ship on the Thames River. That's a river that runs through London and parts of England. He's hanging out with some friends. He begins to tell them a tale, and that tale is his experience in the Congo. This tale takes almost the entirety of Heart of Darkness, except for the last paragraph, which moves the reader from Marlowe's his inset tale, back out into the broader narrative of Marlowe sitting on this boat, swapping stories with his friends. And by doing this, authors certainly add sort of structural interest, but they also do a couple other things. One is that the use of the frame really makes it explicit to the reader that the narrator is actually a character within the story, and one whose perceptions are not sort of all powerful, but may be flawed. It also makes readers more aware of the idea that the story is really a kind of like tale, that it's got some mechanics to it that make the tale really interesting. And then finally, the frame itself actually provides a way of reading the nested story, which we've seen both in The Handmaid's Tale and which we can discuss in Heart of Darkness. Now, Heart of Darkness is a really complex novella. I've read it multiple times. Every time I read it, I really have to read it very slowly and carefully, and I'm constantly reminded of just how complicated it really is. So here's sort of a brief rundown of what's going on. First, Charles Marlowe is kind of an old salt. He's a lifetime sailor and captain. And he tells this story of how one year when he was younger, he decided to try his luck as a captain on a river steamship in the Belgian Congo, working for a European colonial entity who is utilizing African populations to harvest ivory for exportation. Now, Marlowe's tale details his arrival in the Congo and the first few months that he spends at an outpost fixing the steamer, and then his trip down the Congo River to rescue Mr. Kurtz, who is another agent working for this same company, um, whose job it is to bring in ivory and who has fallen ill. Now, during his time in the Congo, Marlowe becomes obsessed with Mr. Kurtz. And Mr. Kurtz is a character that we largely learn about through others. We really don't actually hear that much of his own speech. But many people tell us about Mr. Kurtz, including Marlowe himself. Um, Marlowe, all in all, as a background, finds the colonial enterprise in which he is participating exploitative. He thinks that it's largely carried out by a bunch of mediocre, egomaniacal, petty agents who inflict violence and suffering on the Africans that they employ for their own material gain. And he comes to believe that Mr. Kurtz is someone with sort of higher powers than these other agents, and also that he's someone with purer ideals than them, too. That he's someone who's not only a kind of genius, but also someone who is committed to bringing science and progress to the Congolese people. Um, but when Marlowe and the other agents arrive at Kurtz's outpost, Marlowe discovers that Mr. Kurtz has become obsessed with greed and power. Mr. Kurtz, he discovers, has acquired ivory largely through terror, theft, and violence. He has been executing the people and then putting their heads on stakes right outside of his own home. He has made himself ruler of a local tribe, and he allows that tribe to worship him like a god. Now, Kurtz ends up dying on the voyage back to the outpost, and he seems to sort of redeem himself in Marlowe's eyes through his last words. And Marlowe himself falls gravely ill right after Kurtz dies. He returns to Europe in order, in part, to recover. And he ultimately ends up lying to preserve Kurtz's reputation as a genius and a reformer. Heart of Darkness actually reflects Conrad's own experience working in the Congo. So here's the background to that. In 1890, Conrad was having trouble finding a ship to captain, so he took a job as a captain on a river steamboat in the Congo. It took him a very long time to actually arrive to his outpost, and he only actually worked in the Congo for a few days before returning to Europe, supposedly for health reasons. But those few days appear to have really stayed with him, and I think there's a good reason why. The Congo River Basin in 1890 was not a government colony. It was land owned by King Leopold II, who was the King of Belgium, who operated the Congo as a private enterprise for a series of investors. And under the guise of so-called civilizing people in the Congo River Basin, King Leopold ran a massive company whose purpose was to exploit the region for its natural resources, in particular for rubber, palm oil, and ivory. And even by the standards of other really brutal colonial powers, King Leopold's reign over the Congo was notoriously cruel. His European agents would force local residents to gather ivory, palm oil, and rubber through a series of coercive, violent measures. One method was that they would kidnap whole families, and then they would force the head of the household to meet these sort of impossible quota demands, saying that if they could meet those demands, then they could obtain the release of their own families. In other words, they would essentially coerce them into slavery. And any rebellious activity on the part of Congolese residents was brutally repressed by the Force Publique, a private army that was employed by King Leopold. The favorite method of the Force Publique for putting down rebellions included burning entire villages, killing the family members of rebels, and cutting off the hands of Congolese rebels, including the hands of children. And under the reign of King Leopold, the Congolese population declined from 20 million to 8 million, effectively making King Leopold's venture a massive genocide. Now, King Leopold's venture and the colonial project that he had going on in Belgium inspired public outrage in Britain and in other European countries. And the indignation actually grew so great that in 1908, King Leopold transferred his authority in the Congo to the Belgian government. This sense of disgust and brutality with European colonizers just pervades Heart of Darkness. And a question I want you to think about as you read Heart of Darkness is how Conrad represents the colonial experience in which Marlowe is participating. What I mean by that is this: Conrad clearly represents European colonizers as people who become brutalized, an idea that's epitomized in Kurtz. But what precisely leads the colonists to become so brutalized in this novella? Do they arrive in Africa as already horrible human beings? Does the act of exploiting other people allow the European agents to give free rein to their worst impulses? Or in Conrad's articulation, is there something about the colony itself that is brutalizing the Europeans? And does Marlowe really escape this fate? All right, I look forward to discussing these questions with you on the discussion board. Please let me know if you have any questions.